All right, what about this then? One topic you brought up there, it's quite an interesting one, we could go on a bit still, is obviously you don't have to make it specific to MIBR, but I think MIBR is a pretty good example. There's another reason why it's so tricky to allow players to make their choices. Because, for example, first of all, someone could be a brilliant player but not have great sense in who they want as teammates. Like, mate, I've seen that in sports a lot of the times. Like, you should see some of the players before they got, like, Pau Gasol that, like, Kobe Bryant wanted. Like, he wanted people that were, like, borderline all-stars, because what would happen is the season before, he'd have seen them, maybe he played, like, 2 good games against them, and he was like, get me this guy. Like, that was why he was, like, demanding a trade. And the sad thing is this, all the fans like me who were, like, feeling sorry for him not having help, mate, it would have been way worse for them if they'd have gotten some of the players he wanted. Like, some of those guys, like, I'll give you an example of one. One that he demanded that he wanted was Carlos Boozer. Now, Carlos Boozer was like a borderline all-star for a couple of years, but like, I think something like 3 years later, he was just done. Like, he was like, wasn't even vaguely good. So like, imagine if you've hitched the next 5 years of your career to that guy, whereas instead, obviously what the Lakers did was, his GM was shrewd. Like, he thought his GM was doing nothing. He didn't know his GM was waiting for the right deal to pull the trigger on, so that you don't, as we all know in the NBA, do the Carmelo deal and give away like half your fucking team, but then you get a good player, but it's like 2 players can't win the whole league, you know. So along those lines, like if I don't want to use MIBR, the old example was NIP. One of the problems with those sorts of teams is they either have a really weird taste in the players they want, or even when they get them, they don't envision, well, I'm not going to use him the way he was used in the team that impressed me. Like, I think that was an example I would say for MIBR. Most of those pickups were legit players. They were all people who looked good elsewhere, but for whatever reason, the players in MIBR, whoever made these decisions, just brought them in, and it was like the old NIP foreman where they rotated the 5th spot. Was it the Poison Chalice one? It's like, you thought you were joining NIP, you weren't. You were just joining to do whatever shit they had left over.
Yeah, I mean, I think like if you look at TRK's performance individually, like that's a pretty good example from the previous team. Like, he was just like a very, very average player on that team, and he's looked like a star in many of these games against like good teams now. I mean, like, look, it's like, I think one of the problems with some of these teams where they've had the same core for such a long time is that it's almost impossible to reinvent yourself at some point. Like, unless you bring somebody else to like run the ship entirely and you kind of reboot everything, like it's just almost impossible to like kick all the old habits and like start from scratch. And if you're not willing to do that, then by default, like, you're going to force a lot of players to do things that they're not comfortable and or necessarily are not good at. And more likely than not, like, you know, the way the calendar works, like, there's no good time to make roster changes, right? Like, there's always something right around the corner. So you either basically just like forfeit some number of tournaments where you just say like, listen, like, we're not going to be ready in time. Like, we're not going to be good. We're just going to play and probably lose, and then we'll try to be better sometime later on. Or you do the thing that, like, I think 9 out of 10 teams do, which is like, well, like, we're going to try to fit everything the best way we can today, and we're going to try to win tomorrow, and then we'll optimize. And when you do that, you know, you usually start off on the wrong foot. You start off in the wrong positions, and it's just really hard to get anywhere from there. And by the way, like, that in some ways is also why sometimes you get like these honeymoon periods in new teams when the players do fit from the beginning, because everybody's working well together, and it's like, you know, they fit in the right places. But usually those are the times when you don't get like the crazy returns anymore on top, because you already fit from the beginning. So like, you don't have to do the great work that's going to take you months, but will make you better still over time. Is you'll get much better in like adjusting for things. You know, you'll have like plan B's, or rather like plan C's and D's on everything, because you can just kind of go back on your playbook, like, hey, like, this thing that we ran at this big tournament, you know, 6 months ago, like, let's do that now. And people will generally like at least have a sense of what that is, and you'll just have much more depth to your game. But I'd say that's generally the big difference. And like, that's why it's just hard to make some of these teams work by just like swapping out the 5th guy. And it often would be better to just like swap out 2 players at once, if for no other reason except that it kind of forces you to rethink things and like how everything functions.
I mean, another angle, in my opinion, why the honeymoon period exists, and funnily enough, the old NIP, the 4-man changing the 5th man's another example, because think about it, right? The first 3 months with every player was always fire, when they went from like fucking Makaleli to Alu to Pitt, or Pith, however you said his name. Like, mate, these moves were all working. But the point is, there's another angle people don't think about, right? When your team starts to drop off in results, which is always what necessitates the roster move when you were a top team, what happens is, for the first month or two, when they bring in the player, Well, obviously everyone gets it that like it can't just be that guy, so we've got to fix things as well. So initially they will be like, well, maybe I'll play this spot, or I'm going to reinvent myself. Like when Get Right was like, I'm going to be a entry player now. It's like, mate, that's how you know like they knew that it was the end of the road. It's like when he was willing to swap his whole playing style. But the problem is this. That's great in the early days, and especially if you get those wins, like you're saying, in the honey period. But let's see what happens 4 months down the line when you start losing, and then you're losing all those close games, and then maybe the guy you brought in has a couple of bad games. That's where someone just eventually says, when they've got the veterancy and they can kind of have this pull, I think I'll have my old spot back. And you know what? You're doing this now. You know, that's when you sort of see where the levers of control are.
Yeah, and also, by the way, like that's generally where people will default to. So, you know, like if, like, let's say in a team dynamic where it's the players who decide where, like what the roster changes are, who's going to be playing, not like directly, but, you know, sort of indirectly hold the control over that. You know, if you feel like you are on thin ice and results aren't good and like something's going to have to change, you might feel inclined to push to get back to your most comfortable roles, even if that's not the right move for the team, because that'll help you look better, which might help you stay on the team for longer, which is like another, you know, sort of weird consideration that kind of ruins the team's development to some extent.
Yes. I mean, by the way, because again, I can tie this in, because one thing I think is cool about what we can do on this show is we can sort of allude to or tell anecdotes, especially if we don't put all the names in, that people would be shocked by it, because we're obviously insiders for a long time within Counter-Strike specifically. So an example I'll give people, I'll tie into a sports example, because again, I know you love to read all the books and the biographies, so what you always find behind the scenes is, it's like, this is why I hate it when fans think that like any successful team like get along, etc. It's like, mate, if you even read the great sports biographies, the amount of arguments that go on that just never made the light of day. So I'll give you a good one, right? Everyone famously knows that the Lakers with Shaq and Kobe, obviously there was a power dynamic there, and who was in charge and who wanted to be, or did Kobe want to be like advanced further than his career was, and was Shaq still the top dog? You know, there was all that shit. But here's what people don't know. That really is known because that was the era when media completely popped off. It was the digital age. What people don't know, I think you read the book where it mentions some of this, is when they had the Lakers in the 80s, well, what do you mean, Thorin? That was the one where they all loved each other. It's Showtime, and, you know, there's Cap there. And, of course, he loved little Magic, his little body there. Right, first of all, if you imagine that Kareem liked the fact that Magic came in and played that one game in the finals and got the fucking MVP for the whole finals when Kareem was, like, the better player of the whole series. Like, first of all, if you're the best player in the league, you're never, like, giving away MVPs, by the way. Like, it's like that story back in the day where they gave fucking Nixon from HLTV that MVP. Like, listen, Get Right's a great guy. He'll never say it publicly, but if I won the tournament and I was Get Right, I'd be like, listen, I like stories and everything, but give me that fucking MVP. So basically the story is this: even though that team was so dominant in the 80s, right, because Kareem was like the best player in the whole league when it began, right, if you drafted Magic Johnson to any other team in the NBA, from day one you tell him, it's like LeBron, it's like, you're the best player. In fact, the whole thing's about you've got to learn how to be the best player. Just, you know, sow your wild oats, try and score as much as you can, limit test, you know, learn your game. Instead, in his team, the reason why all his MVPs come at the end of the 80s is when he came in, his job was like, listen, you're really good, but it's his team. It's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So there's literally a point, it was in like the mid-80s, where like eventually, because there were loads of championships, Pat Riley actually had to literally go to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who I think at this point was like 35 or something, and say like, listen, mate, listen, you obviously are a legend and everything, you're going to break all the records, but like, it's got to be his team now. Like I think the phrasing he used was like, it's time to give him the keys to the car, as it were. Now, to a fan, they would think like, what the fuck is that? Like some high school shit. It's like, no, that's what happens with the egos of star players. So like, dude, that's a real consideration in these teams. Like, you can put a young player who should be the star on the team, but the players themselves might not agree with that.
Well, I mean, that's how the Cavs team died, and like I've had some conversations about this, because like at the time, like I was rooting for LeBron's team against the Warriors in those finals, and like of course like that gets pretty depressing pretty quickly, and like just because the Warriors might have been the greatest team of all time in the KD year, so the final Kyrie year, like Cavs were really good that year.
Yeah, they were amazing.
Like you kind of forget like how they just destroyed everybody, because you kind of think back to the regular season when like they're just not trying. Yes. But like that's where that team died. Like if Kyrie doesn't get injured in that OT of Game 1 of 2015 Finals, you know, if two bounces go differently in 2017, like they could have had a three-peat. Instead, like couple things shake out a little bit differently, and like Kyrie's like, all right, I wanted to be my team, so like I'm out, and like look at his career since.
Yes. Oh, it's basically the direct equivalent of when I always say, like, they can say otherwise, and obviously Carrigan's not going to say this because he has to construct his own reality to live in and be able to cope with this. But, like, let's be real. If when it's 15-11 and phases against Cloud9, the Boston Major final, they just win the next round and they win the major together, and all those players who've never won a major look at Carrigan and go, Captain, my captain, you fucking led us to a major. Mate, he'd be in the team right now. Like, they'd still be playing together right now. Like, it's just the way sports are, isn't it? Like, the problem is those peak moments of your career, to us, yeah, they're just a moment, but like that everything hinges on that.
Yeah, and by the way, like you can even trace that back further. Like if they win from that 12-6 lead against NIP at IEM Oakland, like, you know, 3-4 months prior, that was the one where it started. That was the first one that they threw from having like a big lead, because before that they, you know, destroyed New York. They won like 16-5 on average in every game. Like I bet you if they make one different call, they don't lose that one like one on two to exist. They win that game. I bet they win the major. They win a bunch of those other tournaments, and like I bet, you know, Counter-Strike looks very different to today.
You know what? I'm going to make a statement that'll probably shock people right now. And here's the thing. The amount of shit I talk, that actually means something when I say that. Like, because obviously I don't give that disclaimer for the most ridiculous opinions I give that people get mad about. But here's a statement I'll make, because it's a thought I've been thinking about recently. Basically, I've got a video I'm going to do in League of Legends that's about this, where because in League of Legends, they have so many players and they only have like the one franchise league in each major region. It means there aren't enough spots for how many good players there are. There's loads of basically like tier 1 level talent. And because there's only 10 teams with 5 spots each, where you can imagine like there's players basically where like for example, this is no joke, there's a player that's not going to be signed for this next LEC season who was probably like 5th best in the league at his position. And the reason why is, at the moment, because of the finances of the league, there's tons of teams would rather gamble where it's like, well, since you're like the 5th best but you're not the best, I'll gamble on like a cheaper rookie and then I roll the dice and maybe he does turn out to be 2nd best and I've sort of gained, right? So the angle I've come up with to argue against that, because I think that's like an example of where they've taken it too far. Like, I would agree, if we're talking about the 8th best player at his position, that gamble might make sense. But the reason why it doesn't for the 5th one is your actual chances that this rookie is everything that you could have gotten from that player isn't very high in that first year. And so the point I think that people have misunderstood is this. You can have a lot of skill at a game. It can manifest in the game. Like, if you put a player in a certain spot against a random opponent, you see this all the time in the NFL. In the first season, they can look really good. But there's a certain period, I would say it's maybe 3 or 4 years into a career, where a player not only has the skill, but more importantly, it's like, I know it sounds simplistic, but he understands how to win the game. And that is very different from being just good at the game. And so my point is this. When a player knows how to win the game, it's also why sometimes you keep around a veteran whose skill isn't even that good anymore. So you know what? Exist is the perfect example, mate. Because individually, he's only degraded over the last 4 or 5 years. If you just go look at his stats, mate, even in phase, they were atrocious. It was like not just red numbers on HLTV. It was like, you know, he was having like 0.5 ratings and shit. But there'll be certain scenarios you'll put exist in, probably even now, where he'll just win a ridiculous 1v1 that you're like, you know, the eye test tells you there's no business winning this. Like, there's something about like game knowledge like that. That's why I don't want people to think like this era of you recruit the hot FPL players is the way to go entirely either. Like, there's a certain type of veteran will always have value in these games.
I think that the way to maybe put it is like the smart veterans that you have, like they're probably not going to do the dumb things that lose you the game. So like, you know, if the rest of your team is good, like they'll be there and like they'll do their part, and then like the best players on the team will decide whether you win or not. But if you pick,
which is underrated,
if you pick the youngsters and you bet on them, like they actually can lose you the game. You know, they might put you over the top, though it's like far less likely, but they actually can just lose you the game, like almost regardless of what the top players do. And so, you know, like then it just depends on like how good is your team. Like, you know, if your team is super top heavy, you have a couple of the world's best players, then like I think FaZe is a good example of when they picked up coldzera. Like that's probably the kind of team where you don't like, they would have been better with Kirby from day one. Not to say like Kirby's like the great right type of veteran, but like that's a team where you want to have not like youngsters, like regardless of like how skilled or how good they are, but rather just somebody who's already been there and done that. Because like if Cold
just to clarify, by the way,
Cold and Nico play well, like, you know, they can win you tournaments almost themselves.
Right there, I hope people understand, because like that actually sounded a bit confusing. You didn't mean pick up Kirby instead of Cold. You meant pick up Cold and then instead of like, you know, biomass and that like recycle,
Yes.
you just go with Kirby initially, right?
As in, like once you have Nico and Cold,
yes,
like just pick up, you know, sort of like washed veterans, and I think in some ways you'll do better, because then it just relies on the top players and they'll give you a chance. But you know, the top veterans are probably not going to lose you the games.